Hey guys, today I'm going over kettlebell windmill progressions and variations. This exercise is hugely underrated because of the lengthening and strengthening element of the low back and specifically the QL. So many people rave about this exercise helping their low back pain, and there is a reason why. The kettlebell windmill is focused on using the QL at length as well as developing the hinge. The QL is a muscle that is often aggravated and the culprit of some people's back pain. So for those that do have low back pain from an aggravated QL, this does make sense. The hinge is also a tough movement for those with a sensitive back, but also doing the hinge wrong can actually make low back pain worse. So it makes sense to work on your hinge in various ways so that you can reduce the likelihood of any hinge movement aggravating your low back. So the kettlebell windmill actually uses the hinge in quite a complex way in that the hamstrings are very much lengthened and the QL is very much lengthened. In average hinge work, it's not as extreme. So if you can get this one down, other hinge work should be a lot easier. So the QL stands for quadratus lumborum, which translates into square loin, which kind of makes sense if you look at the shape of it. It attaches between the hips and ribs. Its primary role is to stabilize the pelvis and spine, so it's kind of a big deal. The way that it works is it attaches the last rib to the lumbar spine. When one side contracts, it laterally flexes the vertebral column, and when both sides contract, it extends the lumbar spine. It is used in so many movements such as deadlifts and squats, but it is also not used when you sit down for long periods of time and it shortens. Then suddenly when we start walking around, quite often the hip flexor group can be aggravated after long periods of sitting. And if, say, we go straight into a gym routine without necessarily thinking of lengthening this muscle, this can become aggravated and irritated over time. So just a disclaimer, there's many reasons for low back pain. This might not be it. And all these exercises I do recommend. If you've never done them before, please do try them with a limited range of motion and try them without weight first. And bear in mind, you also need very good shoulder flexion for some of these exercises as you're using a kettlebell overhead. So do these with caution. And if you're in doubt, get yourself a joint assessment or a coach. So we're going to start from the very beginning as if you were a beginner. So half kneeling position, 90 degrees, tuck hips under, squeeze glutes. So this is just to end up not being like this. Nothing's going to be able to move right if you start off wrong. So you want to be with the hip above your knee. And if your back is arched, you want to just tuck that under. Another thing to then look into is if your shoulder flexion is adequate. So if your arm can be directly over your shoulder, fantastic. If you are stuck here, then it's probably a good idea to look into shoulder flexion and rotation and work on that before you try loading up this exercise, because you're just going to end up compensating and you could end up even hurting yourself if you don't have that range to begin with. So this also goes for rotation, because what we're going to be doing is our hand is going to be directly above our shoulder in shoulder flexion, and we're going to rotate as we reach down. And as you can see, if you've obviously got weight on top of you rotating and you don't have that rotation, it could also end up hurting you. So those are some conditions to just look into before you do this exercise. So as a beginner, we're going to simply reach for the ground with our hand only, and we're not going to begin with any weight at all. We first want to see what you like with range. So arm directly overhead, hand out in front of you. You're going to bring that hip back the way, allowing this leg to ever so slightly straighten as you reach for the ground and touch your hand to the ground. You're then going to come back up, squeezing your core, and you'll notice you're actually elongating your QL and then using it in order to come back up. So as you practice with this, you want to continue watching your hand, because when you have a weight here, you don't want to end up not looking at it and then this ending up all the way back there, which actually can happen. So these are just some things to think about. As you practice, you can start thinking about using something in front of you to go lower. So you can use a yoga block. I'm just going to use a plate, aiming elbow to the ground. So say this is your yoga block. You're then going to bring your hand out, let the elbow bend, and then you can push up onto your hand and then back up. So bear in mind, this can be difficult for some people. If this is super easy for you, no worries. You just get rid of all of this and straight away practice with elbow to the ground and back up. You will notice that your hamstrings will feel a bit of a stretch, and your QL might feel a stretch as well. All right, so a few tips to consider is keeping your wrist nice and straight so the kettlebell does not end up like this. You want to pump your fist so it's a nice straight line from knuckle all the way to shoulder. All right, so the next tip is basically to push up actively through your scapula and shoulder in order to create more stability as you rotate. So instead of it looking like this, a little bit kind of wobbly, if you just ever so slightly shrug up, watch the kettlebell rotate, you end up with a lot more stability and muscle activation. Okay, so the next is loading it up. Make sure you start with a nice light kettlebell. You're going to ideally not have dogs around. So when this is your first time loading up the movement, make sure you start with a light kettlebell and also begin again, basically. So we're going to start with kettlebell above our shoulder and shoulder flexion, minus dogs. And I'm going to now just lean to the floor while watching the kettlebell and focusing on shoulder rotation. This is basically going to feel very different to what you just did. So then we're going to work slowly to the ground. So with a standing kettlebell windmill, it's the same concept, but instead we are now going to ever so slightly shift the feet off to the side around a 40-degree angle, but whatever you find comfortable really. And to begin with, there are two versions really. You can actually have locked out legs or slightly bent legs. I think it's much easier to control the bent leg version, and if you're not specifically working on straight leg strength, you don't really need to do that one. So So another thing to note is if you are struggling with the back, so you want your spine to stay straight when you're doing this. So I'm leaning back, my hips are coming back, and I'm having a slight bend in my knee to maintain a straight back. I'm only just at a stretch here. So if you are struggling with this and you feel a stretch earlier on, the key is not to fold further than you can bear the stretch, if that makes sense. So if say you are tight here, going further, you're going to start rounding your back. You don't really want to do that. It's not really going to give you any benefit there. Mosquito. So instead, there's two different things that you can do. So one is bend your legs more, and the other is use something to lean towards so that you stop the range of motion just a little bit quicker. So thank you for watching, guys. I hope you found it useful. If you have any requests, please pop them into the comments below, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So the QL stands for quadratus lumborum. Standing kettlebell windmill. A windmill. Okay.